Today in ResearchPRO's Black Gives Back conversation, I am thrilled to have Deborah Aubert Thomas. Deborah serves as the president and CEO of Philanthropy Ohio. She's also served as director of grants and programs at the Princeton Area Community Foundation, and she's experienced coordinating a diversity internship program for women in philanthropy. She's also developed the National Girls Inc. Media Literacy After School program and coordinated the Leadership Scholars program at the Institute for Women's Leadership at Rutgers University. Deborah's previous board experience includes the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, and she currently serves on the board of directors for Grantmakers for Effective Organizations and United Philanthropy Forum. I am thrilled to have Deborah and her amazing wealth of knowledge and experience from over 30 years in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. Deborah, thank you for joining us. And just to get things started, I would love for you to respond to this idea that Black people don't give as we celebrate Black Philanthropy Month. Just kind of kicking things off with the idea that Black people don't give. Black people are, disengaged, don't want to, don't volunteer, et cetera. So I open it up to you to respond to that idea, as well as share a little bit more about yourself, if you're inclined.
Thank you, Regina, and thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I'm excited about doing that. I think, as you said, the idea that Black people don't give is just an idea. Like, where did that idea come from? Because we know historically that we have given. We know that we have given our time, our talent, and our treasure over the years, whether we've done so through our churches and our community organizations, whether we've done so in our families and extending our resources outwards in families. And so sometimes maybe because people don't think of it as the traditional philanthropist route of giving, we've always given. But even in that traditional model, we've also given in that space as well. When you think about early philanthropists, I know you mentioned my TED Talk, and I mentioned some of them in there. James Fortin, who lived from 1766 to 1842, right? So at that time, was a colonial era philanthropist, was giving his money, as well as being an abolitionist. We know of Ida B. Wells, Tommy LaFawn, Bridget Biddy Mason, and others who early in our country's history have given. And I won't even go back to maybe where giving came from before we were on the continent. That's a whole nother conversation. Well, maybe we can have that one day.
Yes.
But also we come to modern day times, we know whether it's folks like Oprah Winfrey or who give, obviously folks of wealth and means to be able to give, but just ordinary folks continue to give back. I think one of the issues that we have, and maybe one of the places where that idea comes from, is like, who's been tracking the giving? Where is the data tell us about how Black people give? I know there's some efforts across the country, aligned with Black History Month and aligned with the soul of philanthropy, that does, looks at a community and says, wait, we know we have philanthropists in our community. We know we have people that give back. And sort of bringing light to that and celebrating it and highlighting it, because sometimes, traditional places that sort of highlight the philanthropy of a community don't always tap into what's happening really at the community level.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you called out those specific examples from history. So the idea of like a Black colonial philanthropist, right. That's amazing. That's powerful. And I think it's easy to, when you talk about who's tracking, who's documenting this history, it's easy to lose sight of that, because so often the narrative that we receive at school, is that you were a slave during these times, during the 1700s, so certainly far from the idea of you're wealthy enough and affluent enough to be a philanthropist. So I think that's really important to have those examples and call those examples out, especially as we celebrate Black philanthropy. So I've been really intentional in reminding myself and others that these conversations It's not necessarily about proving whether or not Black philanthropy exists. I mean, the $11 billion that that we give collectively proves that we are giving, but it's more of a celebration. And, even if it's just conversations among, other Black people, Black fundraising professionals, Black professionals in the nonprofit sector, et cetera. It's just, nice to have a moment and pause. Like, look what we've done, look what we've been doing, and we continue to do today. So I really appreciate that. And you also get to something that's been sort of a recurrent theme around language. So, those people, or are people calling themselves philanthropists? Who's doing, like you said, who's tracking that? Who's documenting that? And so I'm really, really interested in the language piece. And I know you said we're not going to talk about like giving on the continent, that's another conversation. But I'm really, really interested in that, because I think that's sort of, that's a big piece of the gap. It is the language and how we engage people. And so I would love your take on how we, as I'm saying we, like in the nonprofit sector and fundraising, grant making field, et cetera, the field of charitable giving, do we have a responsibility to sort of bridge that language gap? Or, do we have a responsibility to sort of bridge that gap for our communities? And sort of help them understand that, no, you are a philanthropist and this is what comes with it.
Right. I think, I don't know, I feel like I have two answers to that question. One, like our responsibility could be that we do that, right? That we let folks know, like sort of bring them into the more traditional space, or not, or we let the traditional philanthropists know that there's a whole another sphere of this that does not have to align with a traditional philanthropist. And when I say traditional, of course, I mean, what we typically think of. I remember when I first learned about philanthropy, I thought of John D. Rockefeller and Carnegie, like all the, these wealthy white men who, the early 20th century, made so much money, and that they started giving it away. And we don't necessarily know their motives, but it happened, and they were able to establish some institutions and some ways of maybe even inspiring others to also do philanthropy in that way. And so I don't necessarily know if there's that we need to bring our folks in Black philanthropy into that space to try to meet it and match it and use that language necessarily. Or do we create our own? And I know that there are many communities that, we know that the philanthropy happens, and maybe it's recognized, maybe it's not. But I think if we just sort of claim it for what we want it to be, and we decide what we're going to call it, that could be a whole nother thing.
Yeah. And I think there's power in that as well. It kind of gets to the idea of some of the other people that have participated in conversations. Ultimately, we get to the place of like Black agency. And so how Black agency is tied to Black philanthropy. And so I certainly do like the idea of, no, we be philanthropic, we engage in a way that is culturally relevant to us. And we use the language and the terms and the norms that work for us culturally. I like that as it relates to Black agency. And it gets also to something that you talked about in your TEDx around reciprocity and sharing that. So if you could speak a little bit about what that reciprocity means and looks like. And then, I'll leave that there.
Thank you. Well, I guess for me, when I think of power and philanthropy and the power of philanthropy, the power of giving, and then you think about reciprocity in terms of the relationship in that space of, I'll give you some of what I have to help make what you're trying to do happen, versus sort of this charity model of, I'm giving to the least of these, or I'm giving to someone less than I am because I have all these resources, right? It's like, no, I think in our community, philanthropy can have that sort of reciprocity where it's back and forth. And the back and forth may not always be the financial, right? But it's not, there's no hierarchy in it. It's sort of a circulation of power, because I may give to you one day, and then another day I may be the recipient of someone else's philanthropy. I remember sharing the story, and when I opened the TED Talk of, how I became a philanthropist, which was through the church. Didn't call it that then, I didn't know what it was, but at the same time, when I was first learning to do that, because I didn't grow up in the church, and so this was me as an adult, becoming a newly saved Christian and deciding I wanted to learn how to tithe, and what does that mean? And at the same time, I was in graduate school, and I was a recipient of a fellowship that at some point someone had donated into this fund to allow me. They didn't know who I was. They never knew who the recipient of their philanthropy was going to be. So I was receiving philanthropy at the same time I was learning how to do philanthropy through my church. And so, it was movement. It was what I, sort of that sort of reciprocity of the good that philanthropy can do. And it shouldn't just be top down or one way necessarily. It's got to continue moving, and we've got to continue circulating it through our community.
Yeah. And so when you talk about reciprocity, you called this out. So the idea of, like, you're sharing power, you're sharing agency. And I'm wondering, how do we do that? How do Black communities do that without contention? How do you shift power and agency, especially when we're talking about, and I'm thinking specifically of like large, predominantly white institutions, large, long-standing, the institutions that have been around for 100 years, et cetera. And their leadership is all white. The board is all white. The advisory groups are white. How do communities of color, in this conversation, Black communities, how do you shift that power to be more reciprocal without contention? Or is that possible?
Well, the contention may not be avoidable, but I do say that I see some glimmer of hope in some of those longstanding institutions where they are actively learning themselves how to shift, how to share power, and not not necessarily giving up power, when that needs to happen some too. But there's this whole movement called trust-based philanthropy and institutional philanthropy, where folks are learning that as the grant, as a grant maker, as someone who has the resources to pour into communities, I may not know what's best for that community. I've got to have allow for and invite in not just a seat at the table, but it needs to be a seat that holds as much power as the other seats. And it's not sort of just a representation because we have a community member sitting on this advisory group or in this space. And it's got to be, I think, enough of a tipping point where it's not one or two people charged with representing the entire community. And so what is the point of which a board of directors of a grant-making organization reflects the community that they are granting money into? And where those decisions are being made, or where is there an opportunity for the model or the structure of how the grants are made to be about participatory decision making? So inviting, engaging, allowing the community to make the decisions about where those funds should go, because they are closest to not only the organizations in the community, but the issues the organizations may be looking to impact. So I think, but I think none of that comes without some of that tension and contention. Like, it's just impossible. I mean, power is something that, in whatever sphere it's in, even the well-intentioned folks who want to be able to do good, because philanthropy, most people in philanthropy are in it because they want to do good. But it's not easy to always give up power in that space, and to recognize that by doing so, you're really having the best impact you can have.
Right. So as we talk about power and agency, we get to equity and access as well. And so something else that the other work, I guess, that I'm really interested in, or I've heard you speak about the equity funding gap. You talk about that in your TEDx. And so that was really eye-opening for me, like the number of, like, I'll leave it to you to break it down, like the dollars and the cents that are allocated to women, most especially Black women and girls.
Yeah, so as you heard from my bio, a lot of my background has been working in organizations for women and girls. And my interest has always been even honed in on women and girls of color. And so I similarly, when I learned of that the sort of equity gap around, I'd always heard, that there was an equity gap with funding for women, and that, for the giving that is accounted for, 1.6% of that giving, right? So of all the giving, 1.6% going to women.
And so when you say like all of the giving, I'm thinking of the Giving USA report that comes out every year and reports the giving. And so this year it was $490 some odd billion that have been donated as a charitable nation in the United States. So are you talking about that number?
I'm talking about, I believe it's that number. So it's the Women and Girls Index that calculates it. And so I'm imagining they're using that number and they're saying, okay, 1.6% of that are going to women. And then you think of women and girls of color, it gets even smaller to half a percent. And this is foundation giving, so it doesn't necessarily it's not always able to count individual giving in that piece of data. But you can only imagine, right? And we're seeing a little bit more of it, and I'm excited about some of the things I've been seeing even here in Central Ohio around giving for women and girls of color. And we've seen it also in terms of investing in women, businesses run by women of color. I think the last couple of years we have seen an increase of folks wanting, first of all, learning about equity and inequity, and then wanting to say, okay, how do we then shift resources to support that? But it's not enough. That gap is too big.
And that gap, but having that measurement allows us, gives us a starting point. Like 1.6%. So maybe it's not, and I don't have this number in front of me, but I will look it up and make sure I post it in the comments for this video. The amount of that 400 and some billion, the amount that was donated by foundations. And so even that number is still in the hundreds of millions. And so to think that just such a small percent of that is going to women and girls, regardless of their, race or ethnicity, that seems, that's a challenge for me to even be able to just sit with that.
It is a challenge, and what's interesting about it is, oftentimes people want to do things, whether it's philanthropy or investing or whatever it is, because they want to amplify impact. And we know, and I'd have to find this data for you as well that you could share, but I have heard that, there is data that when you invest in women in any community, it does amplify and it reverberates throughout her community, right? And so if we know that that's true, why wouldn't we put more resources there?
Absolutely.
Because it's a win and it's an impact statement that we can make to say we're doing this.
Absolutely. So I'm that gives us an opportunity to set a goal, like your foundation giving to women and girls should be 5%, set a goal, and whatever that goal, whatever it is, it's going to move the needle. I would say 5% is still minimal.
Well, I mean, women, what percentage of the community are we, right? Are we at 50%? Why shouldn't the goal be that?
Exactly. You're exactly right. And then kind of juxtaposing that against the what we know in fundraising, that women influence the gift. And so you would think that there would be more equity there. It wouldn't be so off balance. And I think you mentioned that in Ohio, it's 50 cents.
Yes. 50 cents per, yes.
Per woman or girl?
Yeah, so in the country, it's $6, or just less than $6 per woman or girl of color in the country. But in Ohio, it's 50 cents.
Yeah. And so like during Black Philanthropy Month, we'll take a moment and like really just be intentional about putting forth a call to action.
Yeah.
Like if there's nothing else for us to mobilize around and pool our resources around, would be Black women and girls. And certainly this is not excluding, this is not making light of Black boys. We are in this, absolutely in this together. But, you know, there's the data that proves that the reverberation and the ripple effect when you invest in women. And then there's also the proverb, when you teach a woman, you teach a nation. You know, teach a man, you teach one man, you teach one dude. Right? One guy.
Well, and that's the thing is, though, like you said, right. And when you empower women, you know, you're never empowering just the women or just even the women around her. She is impacting her entire community, men, women, children, like that is happening.
Absolutely.
That is happening. So just, wow, what could it look like, right? If we could get that number up. Yes.
And I think about the Black women I know, like in my professional network. And, you know, the Black women I know, not just in my professional network, but just in the community. And again, an amazing opportunity for mobilization and just to like pick a project. Let's all fund it. And this.
So I want to share, and I don't know how much I'll share exactly, but I was in a room with some pretty amazing women from Central Ohio last week, and it was an event to raise money for an effort for women and girls of color. And the energy in that room was palpable. Like it was just like, wow, we are something, aren't we? You know, just knowing that who was in the room and what, you know, in all different spheres and places and industries and all kinds of things. And then the opportunity to see yourself as a philanthropist. And I ended up, I didn't know I was going there to make a gift that night, but I ended up making a gift. And I was talking to the founder a couple of days after, and I said, you know, thank you. You know, she was thanking me. And I said, no, thank you, because you allowed me to see myself as a certain level. I mean, I've been a philanthropist, I've given in the past, but this was a, you know, monumental for me to be able to make a gift at that level. And I said, you let me see myself in that space. One, because you motivated me. You just were like, this is about this, but also this is really practical. They had a sheet of paper that said, if you make a gift at this level, you could give it over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, you could pay monthly, quarterly, annually, and the breakdown of how much it would cost. And so I could kind of do like, okay, well, if I want to do that, I could do, oh wait, I could do that. I can't write that one check today. I don't have the means. But if I commit over 3 years to make a quarterly payment of X, I could have the impact of Y.
Yeah.
And I didn't see that before. And I was like, thank you for making that plain for me, because I needed that. And I'm sure many people, you know, because you know, sometimes when they say, if you added up how much money you spend at Starbucks, right? You know, it's not hurting you every time, but if you added it up, you're like, oh, wow, that's a lot. Yeah. And so philanthropy, the same thing. Like, you don't have to make it all. If you can't pay it all at once, that's okay. But if you can set up a payment plan, pay it over time, you can really have an impact.
Yeah. And that payment plan is not like, it's not a bad thing. It's not like a layaway.
Oh,
it's
not
like an indication like that you're poor or in desperate straits or anything like that. And it's more of a like, this is a
commitment. It's a commitment. It's like, I believe in this. I believe I want to do this, and here's how I can make it happen. And it felt good.
Yeah,
it really felt good.
So in that case, maybe it's not about the language necessarily, but there was that extra step to like break it down for you. Like, this is how you do this. This is how you become, like, I don't know how much your gift was, but this is how you give at this, a more impactful level.
Right.
Yeah.
And figuring out what is that level for you at this moment in time.
Right.
Because it may be one thing now, and in 5 or 10 years, it may be something else.
Yeah.
But you get in that, you become, and if you're making payments over time, it becomes, I don't want to say it's a habit, it becomes a practice that you then know, oh, this is part of what I do. And so the next time you might up it, or your circumstances might be different. You might say, oh no, this time I'm gonna give a little less, but I'm still gonna give. And I'm gonna keep it coming.
Yeah, especially when you see that impact and that impact story is being told. And so often in my work with nonprofit organizations, I see the momentum on the front end. If we had an amazing women's event or some other kickoff or programmatic event, and people give, but then it kind of fizzles out. They're not telling their impact story. And so I call that out, not as a criticism, but because I know the facts, or donors give because of impact. Like the research is there. 80% of people give because of impact. Meanwhile, only 20% of nonprofit organizations actually tell their impact story. And so that's such a huge disconnect to me.
Oh yeah.
It's like such a huge gap. And if it's like, just tell your impact story, you'll be ahead of
right.
Oh yeah. Just tell one story, send one email out and say, we did great. Send me a picture, whatever the case may be. But I call that out because sometimes the issue is not about whether or not there are donors. It's not about, it's not a lack of prospects. Sometimes the issue is the lack of telling your story, the lack of engagement, the lack of acknowledgement, and the follow-up from there.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, and I wonder how many organizations may have the opportunity to raise money from donors of color, and with the idea around the impact being back into communities of color. And whether or not the work continues to be focused there, or at least, part of the focus is, are you tracking the impact in communities of color so that you have that impact story to tell? Because for some, that may be the reason why they gave. And so even if your impact story is not tracking with their original reason for giving, or your reason, how you asked them originally, you don't want to lose sight of that. You don't want to say, okay, you don't want to move on to something else and then assume they're going to follow you because they're giving you once and they're going to continue to be a donor, when if you haven't tapped into why they gave to you in the first place, you may lose them.
Yeah. And so that is getting more into talking shop, but yes, you're absolutely right.
So
and I think
go ahead.
And I think that as fundraising professionals, sometimes we struggle with that and really assessing, why did you give? Unless it is the major gift donor, and now you have a relationship manager assigned to you, and now I'm building this relationship. What do you care about? What type of transformation would you like to make? So I think it's hard. That's a shortcoming a little bit. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I'm thinking of another opportunity we had as my husband and I together to make a gift that really spoke to us because of one of the options to sort of channel where that gift would help support. It was an educational gift, help support, scholarships, right, for students. And I think about all the other times the same organization came back and would ask for money and was never again targeted, even though that was, and maybe we didn't communicate, maybe we just made the decision, but no one asked us, well, why did you give? You gave this, why did you give? They just assumed, well, I don't know what the assumption they may have made, but they could have asked us and we would have said, well, we gave because we really cared about this piece of your work. Then they could have come back to us and said, would you fund this piece again? Or here's another opportunity similar to that, because that was what caught us. So I'm just reflecting on that now. I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah. I did a webinar last week and it was like an international audience. It was mostly Canada, but there are people from the US, Africa, Nigeria specifically, just different countries. And so I suggested that that organizations conduct donor surveys. Like if you're missing pieces of information about your donor, if you want to understand them better, ask them. You know, one, you got to capture the data and like have the data and use it, but ask them. And the response that sort of gut response was like, oh no, we can't.
Really?
Like, exactly, really? Like, why can't you? You must. You absolutely must.
You absolutely must.
Yes, in order to grow that relationship and figure out why people care about you. Why did they support? And I think, if anything, that should be part of your acknowledgement. You know, like send the acknowledgement, and within that acknowledgement, somewhere there needs to be language. We would love to hear about what you care about most. What brought you to the table? What do you care? What do you want to see next? What else do you want to invest in? But we often don't do that. And I see that, like, because this is my profession and I've done this work for over 20 years. And so I think for me, that's kind of the space that I'm talking about when I say, what is our responsibility as Black professionals in this space? And I don't know that, like, I'm saying that I don't have a perfect answer for it in this moment, but just I think about that, like, but I know better. Like, this is the way we do it, but I know better. And I know how my community wants to receive it. And so can I be a bridge, or can I instruct or create some sort of information or guide or something to help Black donors be more strategic, to be more impactful? Just some of the things that keep me up sometimes. So I appreciate these conversations so I can kind of talk to others and see where others are coming from with some of these things as well. So I want to move into like the work that you do. So I'm a prospect development professional. I'm not a frontline fundraiser. I'm not the one that's shaking hands and asking for gifts, etc. And you've been more, or at least in Philanthropy Ohio, or at Philanthropy Ohio, it's a grant maker. And your background is more of a grant maker from the grant maker side of things as well. And one thing that resonated with me is like you described your work. You said you told your daughter or one of your children that you help the people who help the people. And I absolutely, yes.
Relayers.
Yes, absolutely. I love that.
Yeah. So
my daughter was help the people that help the people.
Yes. When she was 7 years old, I was trying to describe to her what we do at Philanthropy Ohio, and as a membership association of Grantmakers, and we provide professional development for our staff of our member organizations. We do some policy work on with and on behalf of them. And I was trying to describe, I was like, what do you actually do? And I was describing the whole system of nonprofits and philanthropy. And I'm like, well, there are people, organizations that work in communities to help those people. And then there are people who work at organizations who give money to those organizations to help people in the community. And I said, then there's us, we help the people who help the people who help the people. And so really being able to help funders across the state of Ohio learn how to be better grant makers and learn, it's not just us teaching them, it's providing the space and the opportunity for them to learn from one another, the convening space, the networking space, bringing other, experts in to do some learning or just facilitation. It's pretty much what we do. And I said in some policy, some of our members are very engaged in supporting education and health. And now we're also starting to look at housing. And so we also do policy work in the state around that too.
I love that. And that resonated with me, I have to say, because I also, right now, my daughter is 7, but like it's in the last 5 to 7. Between ages 5 and 7, I've had to explain to her like what I do, especially now that I have my own firm and I'm working from home. Like during COVID, it's like, what are you doing? Are you really doing something? But in trying to explain to her, like, no, and I did find myself saying, I help the people who help the people, and so
Nice,
I
nice.
love that you're also using that. And I want to talk a little bit, or just a couple minutes about, at least for me, how philanthropy is not just about my personal generosity, how it is my profession.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've made my profession within philanthropy. And so what am I trying to get to here? I celebrate that. I'm excited about that. And I think that's another space for, especially like Black fundraising professionals, for us to like take a pause and say, look at the good work we're doing. And understanding that, at least in my opinion, this comes from our inherent generosity. Like, it's not just a job. And I imagine for you, it's not just a job.
Yes, it is not just a job. I mean, and it has been, the opportunity to be aligned with work that I think is important. And while it feels sometimes, 3 times removed from community impact, I see the ripple effect. I do see the way that our work impacts, funders who impact nonprofits, who impact community. And so I do kind of, I get the good feelings from that, where I'm doing something good. But also, I enjoy the field. I enjoy the people in the field. And I'm enjoying seeing that the field is beginning to brown a little more, with more folks working in philanthropy, from at all levels, from leading foundations, being program officers, being in support roles. And it's just really great to see. I remember, I actually, we were putting together a list. We were like, okay, wait, who all is in our network? Like, who are all the, we just started this January, a Blacks in Ohio Philanthropy Affinity Group. And so in our work, we often convene affinity groups around many things: geography, role and type of work that they do at their organization. And we know that there are many Black affinity groups across the country. We said, well, why don't we have one here in Ohio? And so in an effort to try to track, well, who are all the folks? And it was just interesting, like, putting on a list, like everyone we know, and then kind of literally going and looking at websites to see pictures of people, like, okay, I didn't know that. And there was a good number of folk, over 60 that could count. And that sounds like it's not a lot, but it's more than I thought, honestly. We don't see each other that often. And so, it was great that we were able to have our inaugural launch virtually in January, and just to see a Zoom room full of brown faces, all working across the state in different capacities. And then I'm excited, we're going to actually meet in person for the first time next month. And actually, Susan Batten-Taylor from ABFE, which is the Association of Black Foundation Executives, so national group. I was talking with her at a conference and mentioning it. She's like, I should come to Ohio and meet with y'all. I said, yes, you should. So I'm hoping she's going to be able to be with us as well next month. And because
awesome.
On the national level, has managed other regional affinity groups, and really they do amazing work around supporting Blacks in working at foundations and in philanthropy.
Yes, so I just want to get connected to that group. Like, I need to be in that group.
ABFE, Association.
The local.
Oh, the local. So that meeting is a meeting. It's a meeting of our members. So Black folks that are working at the foundations that are members of Philanthropy Ohio.
Got it.
It may be, since it's just launching this year, it may be in the future years, we'll expand it out a little bit more and have some different programming that we can do more broadly. But we're really just sort of launching it, connecting folks, since we had been, there have been a lot of changes over the last couple of years when we weren't meeting in person. And so now it's like, okay, we can finally get back together again. But yeah, I'm hoping in the future we will have the opportunity to do some more things more broadly and inviting others into that space and that convening. I know, it'd be great. And, you know, if you think about, okay, a year from now, next August, although I'm starting to look at August like February. Yes,
I know
we
what you mean.
things and we want to have heightened awareness and visibility, but we're not going to stop. And when the month is over, so we got to keep going and make sure that we continue to meet and elevate things throughout the year. So yeah.
Absolutely. I heard, I'm going to butcher her name, but I believe it's Dr. Jackie Bouvier with Black Philanthropy Month.
Okay, yes.
In the WISE Fund. I watched a webinar with her and April Walker with Philanthropy for the People. And Dr. Jackie shared the statistic that more people around the globe celebrate Black Philanthropy Month than do celebrate Black History Month.
Wow.
And it was just like, and thought about that. Like, this is a moment, this is a powerful moment for like mobilization and awareness.
Yes.
And I'm like, I just want to do whatever to celebrate us, but also really intentionally wanted to have conversations amongst Black people. Like I wanted these to be conversations, one brown face to another brown face. And I wanted it to be space, although it's virtual space, but space that was owned by a Black organization. In this case, it's ResearchPRO, which is a for-profit. But yeah, that was really important to me because I see these conversations, I see these celebrations or, you know, panels, et cetera, conferences during August. And like you said, you start to it's like, okay, it's just kind of like February. Because everybody celebrating Black History Month, which is good. But then it also can neutralize I think the importance, the significance of it. So yeah, that's the idea that more people are celebrating during this month is really exciting for me. And again, just the idea of let's just celebrate our giving. Let's just celebrate our generosity. Let's celebrate our existence in this field, because there was a time when we wouldn't have been in this field. Well, that's not true because we have a colonial. Well, I say this, but certainly there was a time when, you know, we weren't working in this field.
Right.
And there's still a lot more room to grow. But just a really important time, I think. And I'm really appreciative of your time and your willingness to join in these conversations and join in the celebration.
No, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. I know there was one thing I wanted to be sure that we left folks with too, is the notion that, you know, I remember, you know, even, you know, before getting to this level of where I'm able to give back, coming together with others, because together we can make a greater impact than sometimes we can one-on-one and on our own. And so the idea of a giving circle, where folks can collectively say, okay, we're each going to put this much into the pool, and then we're going to learn and decide together where that funding is going to go, and then repeating that so that the actual gift that they're able to make is larger than any they could make on their own. And it's also gives the organization, like the organization had to do all of the work to get all those individual gifts, smaller individual gifts. It would have been too much, but collectively, we could come together through a giving circle and be able to make that impact and learn together about philanthropy and what that means, how we want to do our philanthropy, and where we want the impact to be of the gifts that we make. So I want to make sure that folks who may be thinking, well, you know, I'm not there yet, or I'm not sure even how to engage with folks for donors and that level. There's all kinds of models and all kinds of ways that we can do that.
Absolutely. And I think we're in the time where we are seeing, well, the Giving USA report, I think Facebook giving is up to $6 billion. So this idea of giving outside of that traditional philanthropy with a capital P is
Right.
very much, the space is widening up,
Wide
for
open.
that. And this is a wonderful opportunity to consider giving circles. And I just can envision like a group of young millennials, like my daughter's age, mid-20s, coming together and saying, no, we're going to make sure that we're supporting, we're pooling our resources and we're setting a goal of $10,000 this year for a program that supports Black women and girls. Or, be more ambitious, like maybe it's a 50,000 collective gift.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So
so much power there.
Yes, so much power. And what better time to launch and amplify that power than Black Philanthropy Month? Deborah, I am so thrilled. I'm so happy we're able to connect and have this conversation. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights. Thank you so much, Deborah.
Thank you. And I appreciate you and the work that you're doing. So thanks for lifting on these conversations and for inviting me in. I enjoyed it.
My pleasure.